St. Mary's Convent stood like a stone sentinel at the edge of a windswept valley. Its spires clawed at the heavens, and its bells tolled with a sound that carried far into the villages below. For generations, it had been a symbol of holiness, of purity, of unquestionable devotion. And yet, behind its towering walls, whispers had always followed the place like shadows that refused to die. The convent was built in the mid-1800s, during an age of fierce religious zeal. It was said the first stones were laid by the hands of women who had already given up everything: family, freedom, and even names. Once a young girl crossed through its gates, she ceased to belong to the world. She belonged to God, or so the elders declared. But among the villagers, there was another belief, that St. Mary's was less a home of prayer and more a fortress of silence. They said the windows never opened, not even in summer when the valley sweltered. They said the nuns walked barefoot, even in winter, their footsteps echoing against the frozen stone. And they said, though few dared speak it aloud, that the convent devoured its own. The arrival of Sister Catherine in 1892, a new nun, Sister Catherine, entered the convent. She was a pale girl of 19 with a voice soft as wind through reeds. Unlike the others, she had not been forced by family into the veil. She had chosen it, or so she said. Catherine was marked by an eagerness to serve, but also by an unusual curiosity. She asked questions. Too many questions. Why must we pray at midnight, when even the bells are silent? She asked once. Why is the west wing forbidden, when surely there are empty rooms that could be used? Her superior, Mother Agnes, would only give a thin smile. The less one questions, the closer one is to heaven. But Catherine's curiosity had already planted a seed of unease. The first whispers the villagers noticed it first. Deliveries of food grew irregular. The convent, once known for charitable offerings of bread and wine to the poor, became stingy. The gates closed earlier each day. And strangest of all, the bell that marked Vespers sometimes tolled at impossible hours. 2 in the morning, 3:30, as though the nuns had begun to follow a rhythm unknown to the outside world. Inside, Catherine confided in another young sister, Maria. I hear footsteps at night, Maria. Not in the hallways. Beneath the floors. Maria paled. Do not speak of it. The last who mentioned such things was sent away. Sent away, Catherine pressed. That is what they said. But no one has ever seen her again. The missing sister in the summer of 1893, one of the elder nuns, Sister Helena, was gone. No one announced her departure. No prayers for her soul were spoken. Her nameplate was removed from her cell door, and her few belongings vanished. When Catherine asked where Helena had gone, she was told, "She has been called to a higher service." But the words chilled her. A higher service? In the dead of night, Catherine thought she heard chanting from beneath the chapel. Voices too low to understand, yet thick with something primal, something wrong. The atmosphere thickens as weeks turn to months. The silence of the convent began to weigh on Catherine. The walls seemed to breathe with secrets. Even the air smelled strange. An odor of old wax, damp stone, and something metallic, like blood left too long in the open. Every evening, when the nuns knelt to pray, Catherine's eyes would drift toward the west wing. The corridor was sealed with an iron gate, chained and locked, though no key was ever seen. Rumors said that once, long ago, a group of sisters had been confined there for breaking their vows. Some said they died of plague. Others whispered that they had never died at all. The forbidden door one night, unable to resist, Catherine crept from her cell with only a candle. She padded through the cold corridors, heart hammering against her ribs. The west wing gate loomed before her, rusted and heavy. To her astonishment, the chain was gone. The gate stood slightly ajar, as though waiting. She hesitated, the flame of her candle trembling. A chill gust passed, though no window was open. And then she heard it, soft chanting, distant yet distinct, rising from the depths of the forbidden wing. She backed away, nearly dropping the candle, and fled to her cell. But she knew, with a certainty that shook her soul, that something was hidden in that wing, something the church never meant the world to see. Seeds of horror from that night onward, Catherine could not sleep. Every creak of stone, every shuffle of unseen feet, every whisper in the walls gnawed at her sanity. She began keeping a journal in secret, hiding it beneath her mattress. Her entries grew frantic, filled with sketches of symbols she swore she had glimpsed carved into the chapel's foundation. Circles, crosses turned upside down. Eyes, always eyes. Maria begged her to stop. "You are calling attention to yourself. Please, Catherine, destroy it before they find it." The summer heat pressed heavily over the valley, but within the thick stone walls of St. Mary's, the air remained unervingly cold. The sisters rose for their midnight prayers as they always did, filed silently into the chapel, knelt in perfect rows, and sang their chants in voices flat and emotionless. But on one particular night something was wrong. A sister missing when the prayer ended. The sisters rose as one. Catherine counted them out of habit. 1 row, 2 rows, 3, her blood froze. Someone was missing. She whispered to Maria as they returned to their cells. "Do you see it? One is gone." Maria's eyes widened, but she shook her head furiously. "Don't speak it aloud. They will hear you." The next morning, Catherine checked the dining hall. The space was filled with its usual silence, the clink of spoons, the rustle of habits. But there was no announcement, no word about the missing nun. Her seat at the table was simply empty. Later that day, when Catherine passed by the dormitory hall, she saw the missing sister's cell door open. The bed was stripped bare. Her nameplate was gone. It was as if she had never existed. The unsettling routine Catherine noticed a pattern forming. Every few months, one nun would vanish, always in silence, always without explanation. The convent swallowed them one by one, erasing their presence with chilling precision. When she dared to ask Mother Agnes, she received the same answer as before. "They are called to a higher service." The phrase clung to her mind like a splinter. What higher service demanded secrecy, demanded erasure, demanded silence? The conflicting testimonies the villagers, too, began whispering of disappearances. A milk delivery boy claimed he had seen 2 men in dark robes escorting a woman through the convent gates late at night. Another swore he heard screaming, muffled by chanting, echoing across the valley. When Catherine cautiously asked Sister Beatrice, one of the oldest nuns, about these rumors, the woman's lips trembled. "It is not for us to question, child. To question is to invite punishment." Her eyes, however, betrayed terror. The gathering storm one evening, during Vespers, Catherine caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. As the nuns prayed, she saw Mother Agnes slip from the chapel, her keys clinking softly. She moved not toward her chambers but toward the forbidden west wing. For a long, trembling moment, Catherine debated. Then, candle in hand, she followed. The west wing smelled of mildew and old rot. The further she went, the colder it grew, as though sunlight had never touched these stones. At the end of the corridor, she saw Mother Agnes unlock a heavy door and vanish inside. For the briefest instant before the door shut, Catherine glimpsed a staircase spiraling downward into darkness. The chanting rose again, faint but distinct. Maria's warning that night, Catherine confided in Maria. "They take them into the west wing. I saw it. There are stairs leading below. That is where they go." Maria turned pale. Her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped her rosary. "Do not speak of it. Catherine, listen to me. Stop looking. Stop asking. If they suspect you, you will be next." But Catherine could not let it go. The midnight lament a week later, Catherine awoke to strange sounds. At first, she thought it was the wind moaning through the cracks in the stone. But then she realized it was weeping. A woman's weeping, muffled and desperate, coming from beneath the floor. She pressed her ear to the cold stone. The sound was real. Someone was crying in the depths of the convent. The next morning, Another nun was missing. The vanishing witness desperate for answers, Catherine turned to Sister Beatrice once more. You know, don't you? What happens to them? Tears welled in the old nun's eyes. Child, some questions damn the soul to darkness. Pray for silence. Pray they do not notice you. That was the last time Catherine saw Sister Beatrice alive. The very next day, her cell was empty, her nameplate removed. The convent of erasure by now, Catherine could no longer deny it. The disappearances were systematic, deliberate. It wasn't chance, it wasn't divine calling. Something was claiming the sisters, and the convent was complicit in covering it up. Her journal entries grew frantic. Another gone. Their voices echo at night. The west wing swallows them. What lies below those stairs? The villagers know. They whisper, but they do not act. Do they fear the convent more than they fear hell itself? Maria begs me to stop, but how can I? I must know. If I do not, I will be the next name erased. A terrible discovery one evening. While tending candles in the chapel, Catherine noticed a small door hidden behind the altar. It was no larger than a cupboard, disguised beneath hanging tapestries. When she pulled them aside, she found a narrow passage leading directly into the walls of the convent. Inside, the air was suffocating with the stench of damp stone and something fouler still. She followed the passage with trembling hands until it opened into a space beneath the chapel. There, in the flickering candlelight, she saw them. Robes folded neatly, rosaries scattered on the floor, and chains bolted into the walls. Chains with rust that looked far too much like dried blood. Her candle sputtered. She turned and ran, her heart pounding as the sound of chanting swelled behind her, though no one had followed her in. Catherine had uncovered the first true evidence that the disappearances were no accidents. The sisters were not being called to a higher service. They were being taken. The discovery beneath the chapel haunted Catherine. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the rosaries scattered like abandoned relics, the chains bolted to the stone, and the rusted stains that spoke of suffering. She told herself she should stop. Stop looking, stop searching. But the convent itself seemed to pull her deeper, as if the walls wanted to confess their sins to her. A hidden passageway for days, Catherine secretly searched for other concealed openings. She moved cautiously, always with her journal tucked close. Her prayers became mechanical. Her eyes were always on the walls, the floors, the ceilings. And then, one night, she found it. Behind the library, where rows of ancient theological texts gathered dust, she noticed a crack in the paneling. When pressed, the wood gave way, revealing another hidden passage. The air that wafted out was stale, carrying the smell of mold and something more acrid, decay. She slipped inside with her candle. The narrow corridor was suffocating, lined with crumbling stone. As she moved forward, she saw faint carvings etched into the walls, circles intersecting with crosses, eyes staring outward, words in Latin that chilled her, oblatio perpetua, the perpetual offering. Her hands trembled as she copied the markings into her journal. Whatever they meant, they tied directly to the disappearances. Murmurs in the stone that night, Catherine could not sleep. As she lay awake, she swore she heard voices whispering from inside the walls. Not the ordinary echoes of footsteps or shifting stone, but distinct voices, chanting, murmuring, crying. She pressed her ear to the plaster and froze. A voice, weak, pleading, seeped through, spoke her name. Catherine. Her blood ran cold. She stumbled back from the wall, clutching her rosary. How could anyone know her name? How could they whisper it through stone? A dangerous confession terrified. She confided in Maria once more. There are passages behind the walls, symbols carved into stone. I heard voices. One called my name. Maria's face went pale. You must stop, Catherine. Please, for your soul. Do you not see? The walls are listening. They know you're searching. But don't you understand? Catherine's voice cracked. The sisters, they're not gone. They're still here, somewhere in the dark. Maria looked away, her lips trembling. Then pray they remain there, and not with us. The forbidden manuscripts. Days later, Catherine was assigned to help clean the convent's archives. It was here, among the brittle manuscripts and worm-eaten scrolls, that she uncovered something damning. A bundle of parchment, hidden behind false boards, detailed rituals not of Christian origin but older, darker. The writings spoke of sacrifice, of the spilling of blood to ensure purity of the whole. They referenced a vow made centuries ago by the convent's founders, to offer bodies and souls not just to God, but to the watcher beneath. Catherine's hands shook violently as she read. Watcher beneath? Was that what the villagers whispered of? The shadowy figures, the chanting at night? She quickly hid the manuscripts under her robe and carried them back to her cell. That night, she pored over the pages by candlelight, recording everything into her journal. The words blurred, but one phrase repeated again and again. The walls bear witness. The sound behind the altar. 2 nights later, Catherine was called to replace candles at the main altar. Alone, she lit each flame carefully, her breath quick in the cold chapel. Then she heard it again. The sound of weeping, faint and muffled, from beneath the floor. Her knees buckled. She pressed her ear to the stone and nearly screamed. It was not just weeping this time. It was screaming. A chorus of voices, wailing in agony, begging for release. And beneath it all, a chant, low and guttural, in a tongue she did not know. The candle slipped from her grasp and rolled across the floor, sputtering. She fled, heart hammering, her footsteps echoing through the silent convent. The journal of Sister Beatrice. The next morning, Catherine searched the abandoned cell of Sister Beatrice, the elder nun who had warned her to remain silent. Hidden in a loose stone beneath the bed, she found a tattered journal. Its entries were frantic, fragmented, prayers devolving into terrified scrawl. The walls whisper. They move. They breathe. They feed. Helena is not gone. I hear her crying in the night. The west wing hides the stair to the watcher. We are the offerings. The final entry was a single line, written with such force the quill had torn the page. They come for me tonight. Catherine's hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the book. Beatrice had known. Beatrice had written the same truths she herself was discovering. And now Beatrice was gone. The weight of secrets. That night, Catherine hid both her own journal and Beatrice's beneath a loose floorboard. She prayed that if she vanished, someone, anyone, would find them and know the truth. But the more she uncovered, the more the convent itself seemed to turn against her. Her candle flames sputtered without cause. Her footsteps echoed louder than they should. And always, always, the walls seemed to whisper her name. Maria grew distant, speaking less and less, as though fear itself had hollowed her out. Mother Agnes watched Catherine with sharp, knowing eyes. And in the west wing, behind locked doors, the chanting grew louder. Seeds of madness. Catherine began to wonder if she was losing her mind. Were the voices real, or were they the echoes of fear gnawing through her sanity? For weeks, Catherine's nights were plagued by whispers in the walls and shadows moving where no one should be. But the truth was still fragmented, scattered like pieces of a puzzle she could not quite fit together. That changed when a visitor arrived at St. Mary's. A priest, gaunt and weary, who carried with him secrets more dangerous than Catherine could imagine. The arrival of Father Donnellan. It was rare for outsiders to step foot inside the convent. The priest's arrival caused immediate unease among the sisters. He was tall, his face hollowed by fasting or illness, his eyes sunken yet burning with something fierce. His cassock was old and frayed, and he carried under his arm a thick leather-bound volume that seemed almost too heavy for him. He claimed he had come to conduct a review of St. Mary's archives, an inspection ordered by the diocese. But Catherine noticed the way Mother Agnes stiffened at his words. Her lips pressed thin. That night, Catherine overheard hushed voices outside the chapel. "You were never sent by the diocese," Mother Agnes hissed. "You know what I seek. Father Donnellan replied, his voice ragged. The chronicle is not safe here. I will not leave without it. The next morning, the priest was permitted access to the library, but Catherine noticed two sisters shadowing his every move. A hidden book. Catherine's chance came when she was sent to deliver fresh ink to the library. Father Donnellan was alone, his bony fingers trembling as he flipped through fragile pages. When their eyes met, he studied her with unsettling intensity. You see it too, don't you? He whispered. Catherine froze. See what? The walls. The hunger in this place. You've heard them. Her breath caught in her throat. How do you know? Instead of answering, he slid the leather-bound book across the table toward her. This convent was founded on lies. Within these pages, the truth festers. Read, and you will understand. Before Catherine could open it, Mother Agnes entered, her gaze sharp as a blade. The priest quickly snatched the book back, concealing it beneath his cassock. But in that brief moment, Catherine had seen its title burned into the cover, Liber Obscura Sacramenti, the Book of the Hidden Sacrament. The forbidden chronicle. That night, unable to sleep, Catherine crept toward the library once more. To her surprise, she found Father Donnellan waiting, as though expecting her. He held the book close, its leather cracked, its pages brittle. This was written by the first priest assigned to St. Mary's, he whispered. He saw what the nuns did in secret. He recorded everything. The diocese buried his account, sealed it away, but I uncovered fragments in Rome. I came here to find the rest. He opened the book, and Catherine's candlelight fell upon grotesque sketches. Circles etched into the chapel floor. Women kneeling before a black altar. Chains identical to the ones Catherine had seen beneath the convent. The entries described rituals of purification, in which selected nuns were taken below and offered as living sacrifices, not to God, but to something else. Something the priest called the watcher beneath the stones. Catherine felt her stomach twist. What is it? She whispered. Father Donnellan's eyes burned. Not a demon, not a saint, something older, something the church has no name for. But the founders of this convent made a pact. Their vow sustains this place even now. A terrible revelation as Catherine read. One passage struck her cold. The offerings do not die swiftly. Their cries echo through the walls, for the stones themselves are bound to their torment. Thus the convent is never silent, though silence is all it claims. Catherine's mind reeled. The voices she heard, the weeping, the screams, they weren't hallucinations. They were the trapped remnants of sacrificed sisters, bound forever to the stone. Why does the church allow this? She asked. Donnellan's face hardened. Because silence protects power. The church prefers whispers buried beneath centuries of prayer, rather than scandal that could rot its foundations. The vanishing priest. Over the following days, Father Donnellan grew increasingly desperate. He demanded access to the West Wing, but Mother Agnes denied him at every turn. The West Wing is sealed by holy decree, she told him. Late one night, Catherine saw Donnellan slip away, clutching the chronicle. She followed at a distance as he crept toward the West Wing. The door was locked, as always, but he knelt and began to pray fervently, his voice quivering. Suddenly, a hand shot out of the shadows. Mother Agnes. You will not desecrate this covenant, she hissed. The confrontation was brief, but Catherine dared not intervene. She fled before she could see the outcome. The next morning, Father Donnellan was gone. No word, no trace. His belongings in the guest chamber had vanished. When Catherine asked about him, she received the same chilling reply as always. He has been called to a higher service. But this time, Catherine knew exactly what that meant. The journal grows darker that night. Catherine poured everything into her journal. Her handwriting grew frantic, her words desperate. He is gone. The priest knew, and now he is part of it. The chronicle speaks of a watcher beneath the stones. Is that what feeds? Is that why the walls are never silent? God help me. The walls are not walls. they are mouths. Mother Agnes watches in the days that followed. Catherine felt eyes upon her constantly. Mother Agnes lingered near her during prayers, her hand cold and firm when it rested upon Catherine's shoulder. Maria avoided her altogether, as though association had become too dangerous. The case of the Morlok family and the Genain Quadruplets soon spilled far beyond the walls of their home and into the machinery of law enforcement, politics, and scientific institutions. On the surface, it seemed like a routine investigation into a family plagued by mental illness. But anyone who dared to dig deeper quickly realized the ground was far from solid. Beneath every layer of official paperwork lurked something darker, something stitched together with fear, secrecy, and agendas hidden in plain sight. When the authorities first arrived at the Morlok residence, they found a house that felt frozen in time. Rooms were sparse, bare of decoration, filled instead with medical journals, psychology texts, and notebooks written in cramped handwriting. Walls bore faint marks of chalk diagrams and schedules, as though the house itself had become a living laboratory. It was clear this family had been observed, measured, and, perhaps worst of all, controlled. Yet the official reports glossed over many of these details, reducing them to eccentric behaviors of a troubled household. Why? The answer may lie in the larger web surrounding the case. Psychiatric institutions, universities, and even government officials had invested interest in the Genain sisters, often presenting them as living proof of genetic determinism. Their lives and struggles were fodder for theories that supported funding, academic recognition, and influence. To admit that the sisters' suffering had been worsened, or even engineered, by external pressures would have shattered reputations and unraveled careers. Thus, silence became the preferred medicine. Whistleblowers within the system occasionally tried to pierce the veil. A nurse once confided to a journalist that she had been ordered to falsify progress notes. A social worker claimed her recommendation to remove the girls from their father's care mysteriously vanished from the files. Each of these voices was quickly discredited, reassigned, or drowned out by the weight of official consensus. The message was clear. This was not a story meant for public digestion, but suppression only fed speculation. Conspiracy theorists wove elaborate tales about clandestine experiments, secret funding streams, and occult practices tied to St. Mary's Convent, where rumors swirled that the nuns themselves had vanished under suspicious circumstances. Could the Morlok family and the convent share a hidden connection? Was this about more than a family, more than a study? The dots were never fully joined, but the shadows between them grew denser with every unanswered question. For the sisters themselves, the investigations felt like yet another layer of surveillance, another performance forced upon them. Journalists camped outside their residence, their cameras capturing blurry images of 4 young women who had already been stripped of privacy. Officials interviewed them in cold, clinical tones, probing for details that could be bent into convenient narratives. Every word they spoke was twisted into something else, leaving them trapped in a web they never chose. What haunted observers most, however, was the way the sisters seemed to carry an unspoken knowledge, a silent pact of things left unsaid. When pressed about their father, their upbringing, or the strange rituals whispered to have occurred in the dead of night, they would exchange glances, long, meaningful, and heavy with things they could not voice. It was as if they had witnessed something terrible, something unspeakable, and had resigned themselves to burying it within the graveyard of their shared memory. The investigations eventually fizzled out, officially closed due to lack of evidence of criminal wrongdoing. Files were sealed, reports archived, and the sisters were left in the care of institutions that claimed to protect them. But behind locked doors, rumors of abuse, manipulation, and psychological torment continued to surface. The truth had not been found. It had been buried intentionally and with precision. And yet, like all buried truths, it left behind an echo. Those who encountered the Genain sisters in later years often remarked that being in their presence felt unsettling, as though one were standing before survivors of something far greater than personal tragedy. Their very existence became a living indictment of the systems that had failed them, and perhaps of darker forces that had orchestrated their suffering. As the dust of official investigations settled, a more disturbing question began to fester in the public imagination. What if the horrors tied to the Morlok family and the missing nuns of St. Mary's were not accidents of history, but parts of a deliberate design? Time passed, but the shadows of the Morlok family and the Genain Quadruplets never faded. Instead, they deepened, lingering like an unfinished wound on the collective conscience. For those who dared to look closer, the legacy of what happened to them was not merely one of medical curiosity or tragic misfortune. It was a haunting reminder of the price of exploitation, silence, and manipulation. The Genain sisters, always studied, always categorized, lived fractured lives. Each of them carried scars that could not be quantified by psychiatric scales. Their minds had been dissected by scientists, their private anguish turned into charts and papers. Yet their humanity had been left untouched, ignored like an inconvenient truth. Some of the sisters struggled with paranoia, some with catatonia, while others drifted into a numb silence. And yet, even in their frailty, they carried a strange power. Their very existence was a mirror held up to a world that had failed them. The haunting legacy was not confined to the sisters themselves. Families across the country began whispering stories of how their children had been taken into studies without proper consent, how their medical files had disappeared, how social workers had ignored their cries for help. In these echoes, the Morlok family became less an anomaly and more a symbol, a case that exposed the cracks in the system and the human lives crushed within those cracks. But the most unsettling part of this legacy lay in the unexplained. Witnesses who had once visited the Morlok home described not only the oppressive air of discipline and control, but something darker. One recalled a small locked room in the basement, where scraps of religious iconography lay scattered, inverted crosses and fragments of statues of saints defaced in crude ways. Another claimed to have seen journals where the father wrote about voices of the sisters that guided his decisions, voices he believed came not from the girls themselves, but from something that watched over them. Were these the delusions of a disturbed man, or glimpses of something more sinister? No one could say for certain, but the missing nuns from St. Mary's were often woven into these recollections. Their unexplained disappearance folded into theories that the Morlocks were not merely victims of medical oversight but pawns in a ritualistic framework too disturbing to acknowledge publicly. Some believed the sisters were chosen, their suffering a continuation of whatever had begun at the convent years before. The legacy also haunted the institutions involved. Universities quietly distanced themselves from the case, burying their more controversial publications. Psychiatric boards debated behind closed doors whether the Genain study had crossed ethical lines. Yet the funding never stopped, and new studies just as invasive were launched on other families. It was as though the lesson had been learned not in the direction of compassion, but in the perfection of concealment. Those who encountered the sisters in later years often described them in terms that bordered on the supernatural. One nurse said she felt watched by all four at once, even if only one was in the room. Another swore that when the sisters sat together in silence, the air grew heavy, like the atmosphere before a storm. Their unity was unsettling, not because of what they said, but because of what they withheld. They carried a shared silence that seemed to hum with unspoken memories, a silence more terrifying than any words. The Morlok name itself became a whispered curse, invoked in hushed tones whenever discussions of ethics in psychiatry resurfaced. Scholars debated. Was it madness, abuse, or something darker? Were the sisters' lives destroyed by their father's obsession, by institutional neglect, or by an invisible hand manipulating events for purposes unknown? Each possibility was terrifying in its own way. Even decades later, those legacies ripple outward. Books, documentaries, and even whispered folklore keep the memory alive. And yet, no matter how much is written, no matter how many theories are proposed, the story refuses to settle into neat conclusions. The questions remain suspended, gnawing at anyone who encounters them. Why were the Morlocks allowed to operate under such secrecy? What really happened inside the convent before the nuns vanished? Were the sisters victims of science, faith, or something else altogether? The haunting lies not only in the suffering endured but in the deliberate absence of answers. The Genain Quadruplets and the Morlok family left behind a legacy that is less a story and more a shadow, stretching across generations. Those who peer into it rarely emerge untouched. For some, it inspires anger and calls for reform. For others, it ignites conspiracy theories that blend fact and fear into something inseparable. But for the few who claim to have looked directly into the heart of the case, who claim to have read the unredacted files or spoken to the last remaining witnesses, the haunting legacy is much simpler and much darker. Some truths were never meant to be uncovered. And perhaps, the greatest horror of all is that the suffering of the Morlok family and the Genain sisters may not be unique. Perhaps they are simply the ones we happen to hear about, while countless others remain hidden, erased, their legacies yet to come screaming back into the light. For years, the Morlok family and the Genain Quadruplets were treated as isolated anomalies, their suffering attributed to mental illness, genetics, and poor family dynamics. But behind the veil of official reports, a thread connected them to something older and more insidious: St. Mary's Convent, the place whispered about in local legends as a site of disappearances and unspeakable rituals. It was only when independent researchers, journalists, and a handful of obsessed investigators began digging that the web between the convent and the Morlocks started to reveal itself. At first, the connection seemed circumstantial. Records indicated that the girl's father, before his descent into paranoia and obsession, had worked briefly as a groundskeeper at St. Mary's. He left under unfavorable conditions, though the nature of those conditions was deliberately left vague in church archives. Some hinted at his involvement in an incident that coincided with the sudden disappearance of several nuns, a disappearance explained away as a transfer to a new parish. Yet no trace of those women was ever found. Neighbors who had known the Morlocks recalled strange pilgrimages the father took late at night, long walks toward the ruins of the convent after it was abandoned. He would return home covered in dirt and ash, clutching notebooks filled with half-legible prayers written backward, pages smeared with candle wax and drops of something darker. It was during this period that his behavior toward his daughters shifted from strict discipline to outright domination, as though he had imported something from the convent's decay into the walls of his own home. The similarities between the convent's history and the Morlok household grew harder to dismiss. St. Mary's had long been accused of conducting cruel psychological purification rituals on novices who failed to conform, isolating them for days in silent cells, feeding them only bread and water, and forcing them to write confessions of imagined sins. Survivors spoke of hallucinations, of voices whispering through the cracks in the stone, of shadows moving where no light should cast them. The same language appeared in the journals recovered from the Morlok home. One entry, scrawled in a trembling hand, read, "The voices of the saints command me. They say the girls must be tested, purified, divided until the true vessel emerges." As investigators pieced these fragments together, a disturbing theory began to emerge: that the father had been indoctrinated into, or willingly embraced, the convent's forbidden practices. His daughters became the next generation of subjects, subjected not only to psychiatric observation, but to rituals that blurred the line between religious penance and outright torture. The connection deepened when researchers unearthed a ledger from the convent archives, hidden in a sealed trunk. Among lists of daily supplies and names of novices were cryptic notations, for crosses marked side by side, each with initials eerily close to the names of the Genain sisters. The ledger was dated years before the quadruplets were even born. Coincidence? Or prophecy? Some argued it proved nothing, while others insisted it suggested the girls had been marked long before their birth, chosen for a fate that neither science nor faith could explain. Whispers spread that the missing nuns had not disappeared at all but had been offered in some kind of pact. Local folklore claimed that the convent was built on cursed ground, where rituals older than Christianity had been practiced. If true, then the Morlok father had not invented his cruelties. He had inherited them, carrying out a cycle that began long before his family existed. Eyewitnesses who dared to explore the convent ruins in later years claimed to hear distant chanting when the night was still, or to see faint candlelight flickering in the windows of the abandoned chapel. Some swore they saw figures moving in the corridors, women in habits who vanished when approached. Most who ventured there left shaken, convinced the convent was not empty but inhabited by something that remembered, something that waited. The sisters themselves, when asked about the convent, often grew quiet. In rare moments, they admitted to dreams of long corridors lined with crucifixes, of cloaked women standing at their bedsides whispering prayers they could not understand. One even confided to a nurse, "They're still with us, the nuns. They never left." The connection between St. Mary's and the Morloks was never officially acknowledged. The church maintained its silence. Law enforcement dismissed the rumors as superstition, and psychiatrists cautioned against blurring faith with science. Yet the parallels were undeniable. Two institutions, the convent and the psychiatric establishment, using control, isolation, and silence as tools of domination. The sisters had been at the crossroads of both, their lives consumed by a pattern older than themselves. And so, the question remained, were the Morlok family and the Genain Quadruplets victims of a failing system, of inherited madness, or of a deeper curse rooted in the stones of St. Mary's convent? The answer, like the nuns themselves, had vanished into the shadows. For decades, the story of the Morlok family and the Genain Quadruplets lingered in half-light, half-fact, half-rumor, half-nightmare. But in the end, when the scattered pieces of testimony, lost journals, convent ledgers, and whispered confessions were placed side by side, they revealed something that went far beyond psychiatry, beyond faith, and beyond the comfort of rational explanation. It was not just a story of mental illness or abuse. It was the unveiling of a forbidden truth, one that institutions on every side had tried to bury. The forbidden truth began with patterns. Every investigator who traced the family history noticed the same strange symmetry. Generations of twins, triplets, and finally the quadruplets, as though something unnatural was selecting this bloodline. Parish records showed that the Morlok ancestors had once lived close to the land where St. Mary's convent would later be built. Whispers suggested that they had been part of secret societies, that their children had been dedicated to an unknown order centuries earlier. The sisters, then, were not merely unfortunate victims. They were part of a lineage marked for sacrifice, study, and manipulation. A chilling revelation came when a hidden cache of documents was discovered in the ruins of the convent chapel. Inside a decaying chest were letters written by one of the missing nuns. The letters described a ritual of the four, an ancient practice meant to separate the divine from the diseased. The nun wrote of dreams where she saw her children standing in a circle, their shadows longer than their bodies, their mouths speaking in unison words she did not know. Terrified, she begged to be released from her vows. Weeks later, she vanished without a trace. When these letters were compared to the journals of the Morlok father, the parallels were undeniable. He too wrote of the four, claiming that only by dividing them could one find the vessel strong enough to hold the voice of heaven, or perhaps, something darker pretending to be heaven. His treatment of the sisters, then, was not just abuse born of madness. It was ritual, a continuation of the convent's hidden practices, passed down like a disease from stone to soul. The final piece of the truth came from the sisters themselves. In one of their last recorded interviews, a social worker asked them directly if they believed their suffering had meaning. For a moment, they sat in silence, their eyes darting between one another. Then one of the sisters whispered, almost too softly to hear, "We were never meant to survive. We were meant to show them the door." The worker pressed for clarification, but none came. The sisters withdrew into silence, their faces blank, as if they had already said too much. Yet that single sentence has haunted everyone who studied the case since. What did they mean by the door? Was it metaphorical, a way of describing how their suffering opened the world's eyes to cruelty, or was it literal, a doorway to something that the convent, the father, and even the nuns themselves had been trying to open? Those who believe in the darker interpretation point to the inexplicable phenomena that continued around the family. Nurses swore that the sisters would sometimes speak the same words simultaneously, even when placed in separate rooms. One psychiatrist recorded an event where all four, in different wings of the hospital, began humming the same hymn at the exact same moment, though none had been exposed to it before. Skeptics dismissed these as coincidences or fabrications. Believers saw them as proof of something that had always been there. A shared connection, perhaps supernatural, that made the sisters less individuals and more fragments of a single entity. The forbidden truth, then, was not a single revelation but a tapestry of horrors. A convent that disappeared its own nuns, a father indoctrinated by ancient rituals, institutions complicit in exploitation, and sisters who may have been both victims and vessels. Every piece pointed to the same unsettling conclusion, that human suffering had been harvested deliberately, for purposes no one dared name. In the end, no one could silence the story completely. Though files were locked, though the convent lay in ruins, though the sisters themselves faded into obscurity, the legend grew. It passed from researcher to researcher, from journalist to journalist, from whisper to whisper. The Morlok family and the Genain Quadruplets became more than a case study. They became a warning that beneath the surface of hospitals, churches, and schools, there are corridors no one wants to walk down. A warning that silence can be more dangerous than screams. And a warning that sometimes the greatest horrors are not the monsters we imagine, but the institutions that insist they do not exist. The forbidden truth was simple yet unbearable. What happened at St. Mary's, what happened to the Morloks, was not an accident. It was design.